Welcome everyone to the University of York, to the Festival of Ideas, and to today's speaker, Robert Toombs, author of This Sovereign Isle. My name is Sue Mendes. I'm a retired professor of political philosophy here at the University of York, and it's a very great pleasure to welcome, introduce and discuss with Robert Toombs. Robert's Emeritus Professor of French History at the University of Cambridge, and also a Fellow of St John's College. Much of his teaching and his writing has been on French and European history and on Franco-British relations, for which he was awarded the Palme Académique by the French government. In 2014, he published a book, The English and Their History, was published to great acclaim, and since then he has become a frequent commentator on contemporary issues and is co-editor of the pro-Brexit academic website, Briefings for Britain. Today, Robert will be talking about his most recent book, This Sovereign Isle, Britain in and Out of Europe. And after his talk, there'll be some time for discussion. So welcome to everybody here and welcome, Robert, to you.
Thank you very much, Sue, for that kind introduction. Thank you for the invitation to speak at the festival. I'd like to start by perhaps explaining or justifying myself for having written a book like this. As Sue said, I've spent my whole career practically writing about France. And British politics was not part of my remit, and activism in a political sense was certainly not. If anything, I would have commented on French politics, not British. But I did get involved in a way that I can't now wholly remember in the debate about Brexit and the referendum. So I'd never been particularly involved in anything to do with the EU, which I suppose, like most people, I regarded as, you know, like the weather, something that you live with. It's just a fact of life. And certainly I was not at all sure which side I would vote on in the referendum. And I remember two things that really affected my decision. One was I attended a meeting, an open meeting in Cambridge, at which one of my colleagues made the very obvious point that we had to vote now, because I'd asked a question at the end of the meeting, and I'd said, you know, why don't we wait a few years and see how the EU was progressing, and then maybe we could decide when things were clearer. And he said, well, this is it. You know, we have to vote now, and we may never vote again, which I think may well have been true. So that was a thing that forced the decision. And the other thing was, of course, I was worried, as nearly everyone was, about the possible economic consequences of leaving the EU and whether it was going to be a disaster, as official sources and most economists predicted. And indeed, had it been a disaster, it would have been obviously irresponsible to vote for it, not simply because it would weaken the country, but because it would mean damaging effects on the lives of so many people. And I had the good fortune to be having dinner at a friend's house with a distinguished economist, in fact, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, an American called Kenneth Arrow, who had recently signed a letter in the Times with other Nobel laureates, if I remember rightly, saying that he opposed Brexit. So I said to him, do you think it's going to be an economic disaster? And had he said yes, I think I would have voted to remain. But he said, I remember very clearly, he said, no, it won't be a disaster. It will need some adjustment, but certainly no disaster. And so I thought in that case, it was a choice that we were free to make. And essentially because I thought that the way the EU was developing towards an ever less democratically accountable and ever more centralized exercise of power, that it was something that we should not be part of. In any case, it seemed to me that our position within the EU was a very unstable and unsatisfactory one, as being always half in and half out, always reluctant to go along with what the other leading member states wanted, a sort of dog in the manger position that I thought was not good for us and not good for the EU, and which I thought needed to be resolved one way or the other. So that's how I got involved in the discussion. But, as an individual, the reason I got involved more actively and in the end finished up by writing this book, which I never expected to do, was because I got involved with a number of academic colleagues who were finding it very difficult to get their voices and their research published. The academic establishment and indeed the financial press was overwhelmingly anti-Brexit, and it was quite difficult for other views to be heard. So we set up a website to make that possible. So that's how I got into this. And writing a book was the obvious outcome. But it's a history book. I'm a historian, and that's how I think. I'm too old now to learn new tricks, and I couldn't write a book about political science. I couldn't really write a book about economics, but I thought I could write a history. And so this is essentially the story of our relationship with Europe from the beginning. Because I think the historical background is important because it helps us, which is what history, I suppose, mainly does. It helps us to understand how we ourselves and how other people think about the world. It helps us to understand our own prejudices, our own assumptions, and therefore, I hope, to make a clearer-minded decision. So the book begins at the very beginning, in prehistoric times, and it skips through very fast our relationship with Europe over many centuries. And the argument really is that our relationship with Europe has been a very fluid one, with different parts of Europe at different times, part of France, practically, part of a Scandinavian empire before that, part of the Roman Empire at the very beginning of our recorded history, connections with the Low Countries, connections with Germany. And so the idea that we would be fixed in a fixed relationship with Europe was a rather unusual one, which came up in the post-war period, essentially, I think, as a reaction to loss of empire and a feeling that Britain was a country in decline and needed to be rescued from itself by joining a larger group. Well, that proved not to be the future, at least not to be the long-term future. But that was how people thought at the time. So my book is a history because the way we think about Europe and the EU and the way other European countries and people in Europe think about Europe and the EU is very much colored by our understanding of history, our understanding of the past, and therefore what we think the present and the future are likely to be. So a dissection of history seemed to me to be essential to understand what was going on. And so that's what I tried to do. I'd like to summarize three main points that I think come out of the book. Okay, the book's a story. It covers quite a lot, therefore. And I'm not going to try and summarize the whole thing, which I hope those of you who are interested and who may even buy it will see that there's quite a lot in it, though it's a shortish book. But I think there are three main points I'd like to make now. They're pretty obvious points. And indeed, if I could say in parentheses, often I find when you write a book, you end up thinking everything I've said is so obvious. Doesn't everybody know this already? And that may be true. So I apologize in advance if what I'm going to say is obvious and something that you already know. But three main points. The first point is about what academics often call exceptionalism, which I take to mean that you think a particular country or culture is exceptional, which usually means to say it's different from all the others. Therefore, British exceptionalism would mean that Britain was different from all those Europeans. And this was a popular view, I think, on both sides of the argument. If you were an anti-Brexiteer, you would see British exceptionalism as being about arrogance, nostalgia for empire, racism, xenophobia, unwillingness to cooperate with our friends and neighbours on the continent, etc. So Britain was different, and different in a bad way from Europe. And of course, on the Brexit side of the argument, sort of, the other side of the coin, Britain was exceptional in a good way. Britain was more attached to parliamentary government, to the idea of national independence, to a determination to make government accountable to the people in a way that those benighted Europeans often weren't willing to go along with sort of bureaucratic rule. So we were different in a good way, or we were different in a bad way. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that this is at best an oversimplification. I'm not saying there's nothing different, and I'll go on to that in a minute. But the idea that we are different and were different in 2016 from those Europeans seems to me simply wrong. And what I would say instead is that the EU as a system always provoked resistance and suspicion all across Europe. Indeed, practically every popular vote that's been held in all EU countries, or in those few EU countries that have had votes, has been negative. Not to join the euro, not to approve the EU constitution, as in the famous cases of France and the Netherlands in 2005, and so on. So the idea that the British are uniquely hostile to the EU and European countries are in favour of it is simply untrue. And if you look at opinion polling in 2016, British views of the EU were very similar to those all across Europe. In Greece and Italy, the EU was much more unpopular than it was in Britain. In France, it was somewhat more unpopular. In Germany and the Netherlands, it was about as unpopular. And the reasons for that are pretty obvious. Ever since the adoption of the euro, the Eurozone economies have been growing very slowly, and in some countries have been completely stagnant or indeed in recession. Greece is the most obvious case. And that is largely due to the policy of the EU. The Eurozone itself is a very flawed system, which causes great economic damage to some, even though it causes considerable economic benefit to others. So the British, as I say in the book, voted in 2016 as typical Europeans, or at least the English and the Welsh did. The Scots and the Irish, of course, voted to stay. But that was a very unusual situation in Europe. If we take that vote as being a sign of support for the EU, it would make the Scots one of the most extravagantly pro-EU countries in Europe, much more so than our Western European neighbours. So the British were not different in that sense from other European peoples. In fact, they voted as typical Europeans. Now, I think that's actually the basic point about attitudes to Europe, if we're taking the populations of European countries as a whole. And a graph would show this fairly clearly. Support for the EU peaked in the 1990s. Ever since the adoption of the euro, it has been falling. And it's been falling as intra-EU trade has been falling, as the effectiveness of the EU as an economic system has been falling. And it seems to me that this is simply because most people realize that the EU is not really benefiting them. I'm talking about in most parts of Europe. And that they are reluctant to give more power to European institutions. So that's a common trend. But nevertheless, I think there are some differences between particularly, and now I'm going to, you might think, say something rather different, and I'm saying something slightly different. There are nevertheless differences between British and attitudes in many other EU countries to the EU as an idea. Leaving aside the question of whether you think it's good or bad, or it's working or not working, what do you think of the EU as an idea? And there is something of a difference, which I think many of us realize. And it's a difference that comes really from the history of the 20th century. Our history, the 20th century, is a terrible century, of course, 2 world wars, depressions, genocide. But it was a century that we experienced in a less terrible way than did the European continent. It was not, for us, a time of civil war, genocide, invasion, occupation, defeat, and all the rest. Therefore, there was less of a sense that we needed to be saved, or that Europe needed to be saved, and we, as part of it, needed to be saved from our history, that the EU is, in some sense, turning a page over the awful history of Europe in the past and and bringing something new. We never clearly felt this so strongly, and this is shown, I think, in general attitudes over the years to the EU, which was seen really as an economic organization, not as a great utopian project. What does this mean precisely? I think it means that a smaller proportion of let's say, the middle class in Britain is deeply committed to the idea of Europe than in many continental countries. So general views may be rather similar, but within the middle class, there's a less of a commitment to the EU as an idea than elsewhere. And that means that Euroscepticism in Britain is simply a more mainstream political phenomenon. Whereas in most countries, France, Germany, Spain, Italy, Greece, it is confined to the political extremes of left or right, but not really in the centre. Here it's much more a centrist phenomenon, and therefore is able to pick up more support. And also, as I say, among the, if you want to call them the political class, the middle class, those who tend to make decisions on behalf of the rest, commitment was less great. And I think one thing that shows that, which seemed to be quite interesting, is that although in some European countries in 2016, the EU was more unpopular than it was in Britain, as I've said, there were also more people in those countries who wanted the EU to be given more power. In other words, the idea of more Europe as a solution to Europe's problems appealed to more people than it did in Britain, when even people who said that they were in favour of the EU thought that it should have less power. In other words, you say, look, the EU is not working very well. In Britain, you tend to say, therefore, take back more power from Brussels. In France or Germany, you tend to say, let's give more power to Brussels. So that's a difference that history creates. Otherwise, not much difference in 2016. And some of you may have watched Emmanuel Macron talking to Andrew Marr in January 2018, in which he said, which certainly opinion polls showed, that most people in France would have liked to have a referendum on EU membership. And he said such a referendum would probably have voted to leave, or indeed, he said, would have been very difficult for us to win. So, point number one, Britain and Europe are not really all that different in their ideas about the EU or their feelings about the EU. Second point, why has only the UK left? And why in the foreseeable future is it only the UK that appears likely to leave? The foreseeable future, as I say. And I think two reasons. One is that the original reasons for joining were weaker in Britain. As I say, I'm not going to repeat this point, less of an emotional commitment to the idea of European unity. And that the original reasons for joining, which were mainly economic, got weaker over the years. One of Edward Heath's advisors back in the early 1970s said, Britain is the Titanic, Europe is the lifeboat. And that was the main reason why we joined. But it's clearly not the case now. And therefore, the reasons for staying in are weaker than in a country like, say, Germany or France, or are perceived to be weaker. And the disadvantage is rather greater. But the second reason why only the UK has left is blindingly obvious, but nevertheless, I think the most important. And one is that we had a vote. Think back to what Emmanuel Macron said. Only we had a vote, and most European politicians and European commentators think this was crazy. This was all Cameron's fault. You should never allow people to vote on a matter like this. It's much too important for the electorate to decide on, and therefore you just don't give them a vote. Or if they vote, you tell them to vote again. But simply to let them vote and then to take that as being decisive, it was crazy. And that's what most European politicians and many European commentators think. So we had a vote. And the second equally obvious reason is that we were not in the euro. As I pointed out a minute ago, in some countries, notably France, Italy, and Greece, the EU in 2016 was much more disliked than it was in Britain, and for very obvious reasons. But there's no question of them voting to leave, because once you're in the Eurozone, effectively you cannot leave. Or if you decide to do so, you are taking huge risks with the national economy, with the whole financial system, and hence with your own savings, your own mortgages. Your savings in the bank may halve in value. For most people, that's not a very attractive scenario. So if you're in the euro, you're essentially stuck. So however much you might dislike the EU, there's nothing you can do about it. And that, I think, as I say, you see most clearly in the case of Greece, which has suffered far more from EU membership than any other member state. I think every other issue, I would say, was secondary to this. Had we been in the euro, everything else that I said, everything that one can say about historical differences, cultural differences, differences in the political spectrum and so on, are as nothing by comparison. Had we been in the euro, then all these things might have made us discontented members, but they would not have made us leave. There surely can be no doubt that had we been in the euro, the small majority in favour of leave would have become a much larger majority in favour of remaining. For that reason, I think I would say that Gordon Brown, who kept us out of the euro, is really the father of Brexit. And my third point, and final point, was Brexit inevitable? Well, what I've said suggests it wasn't, or at least if you imagine that we might have joined the euro, which we could easily have done after all, Tony Blair was in favour. Had we joined the euro, we would still be members. Therefore, it was not inevitable. But assuming that we're not in the that in fact reality happened, that we imagine us not being in the euro, as we were not, then was Brexit inevitable? Probably not, but after all, the majority in favour of leave was very small. So not inevitable, but actually quite likely. And the reasons for this are both political and economic. One of my colleagues at Cambridge, Professor Helen Thompson, has written that after 2005, after the promised referendum on the European Constitution was scrapped by Tony Blair after the French voted no. After that, she thinks that the only way that Britain could have stayed in the EU was if there had never been a vote. And she writes, a no vote would have been likely, whatever the question on the ballot paper. So if you assume that for the foreseeable future there would never have been a vote on European membership, then we could have stayed in. But had there been a vote on European membership or on any issue to do with Europe, we would have voted to leave. Well, of course, we don't know, but that seems to me quite likely. And because it's part of the general decline in support for the EU across Europe, and because of our greater freedom, our less emotional attachment, above all, our not being members of the euro, then any vote would have been likely to be a negative vote, or if you like, a positive vote for national independence. The results of Brexit, I say this as in conclusion, for Europe, for the EU itself, for a time at least, Brexit consolidated the EU, not just because of the departure of its most awkward member. The long-term effects of that may or may not be significant, but because the turmoil that Brexit caused politically within Britain, very thoroughly reported by the continental press and media, because of the fears of economic disaster that, of course, many commentators and indeed the government itself and certainly the opposition continued to propagate. You remember the cliff edge, the disaster that Brexit was going to bring. All these things which were reported very widely on the continent, and indeed even more negatively, certainly made the costs of leaving the EU very dramatically visible. And so this did not make the EU more popular. Only a number of years of real economic success could do that, but certainly made the EU seem an inevitability, and therefore increased a feeling of acquiescence. You've got to make the best of the EU, because there's no way really out of it. And again, Emmanuel Macron, whom I mentioned earlier, is really the best or the most eloquent exponent of this view. He made a famous speech at the Sorbonne in which he said, Europe is in crisis, the EU is facing disaster. The only way forward is greater integration, that the EU must be able to take over the running of national economies, tax systems, immigration, defense, and all the rest. So this is the forward flight response to Brexit. Europe must go much further. And if that succeeds, of course, then Brexit will have very little damaging effect on the EU and could even have a stimulating effect. It seems to me that it's not likely to happen and that it may cause more problems than it solves, because I don't think most people in Europe are very eager to hand over power from their own governments, who have already lost a great deal, to an essentially undemocratic structure. It seems to me that's not a solid basis for a great political project of the future. The great problem is the Eurozone, and no way of solving this problem has really been suggested. The absence of any reform agenda for the EU, the difficulty of even imagining one that would make it more democratic as opposed to more centralized, has not really appeared. So it seems to me that the EU will carry on from crisis to crisis, essentially trying to keep itself going, and that the management of the Eurozone will be its great and perhaps its only purpose. And as I say, there's no real way out of that, or at least none has convincingly suggested. What about for us? Well, the disaster predicted so confidently by many has not happened and shows no sign of happening. The dramatic and tragic handling of the COVID disaster has shown the EU as ineffective, duplicitous, I'm afraid, and has certainly greatly reduced its prestige among its own citizens. Whether that in the long term will have a great effect on the politics of the EU, I wouldn't like to predict. It's likely to have a major impact on its economy, and not a good one. So we've been very lucky to get out of this faster. And I think inevitably, the result in the short term will be to consolidate, well, it has been already, to consolidate support for Brexit and to weaken any desire to rejoin the EU. But in the longer term, what's the point of Brexit? Of course, there are lots of things one could say: the ability to direct our own trade policy, the ability to sign free trade deals with other countries. The importance of these things probably somewhat exaggerated. It seems to me the main thing is simply to be able to reassert democratic accountability as far as that is possible. No country is entirely free to do as it wishes, never has been. But as far as possible, we will, I hope, reassert control over our own government. And secondly, this is a less precise aim, but I think if Brexit is to be seen as a success, it's one that is essential, that it has to be a sort of galvanizing effect on the whole British state and our way of governing ourselves. The fact that we are now responsible, we're not simply one of the pack, means that we have to try to solve our own problems. We have to try to repair the things that are wrong with the country, both politically and economically and socially. And therefore a great deal depends on us, our governments. But these decisions are ones that we have to take in the future. We can't leave them to other people. And that, I think, is essentially what will decide whether in future years people will see Brexit as a success or a failure. Just a final thought. I think I say this in the book. How will Brexit be remembered? Well, I hope it won't be remembered very much at all in 50 years' time. History doesn't remember very much, and it usually only remembers disasters, wars, civil wars. And this will be seen, I hope, as a fairly minor change of direction, a move away from a not very successful and not very functional trading bloc towards a more global set of connections. But most of us, I think, have probably forgotten the civil war in Ireland in the 1920s. And that was far, far more serious than Brexit, and yet it's hardly a blip in our national memory. So I think in 50 years' time, Brexit, and I hope, will hardly be remembered. And only if it's a disaster will it be, and I don't think it will be. And of course, I hope it won't be. So that's all I want to say. And now I look forward to a conversation with Sue.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Robert, for extremely lucid and engaging defence of Brexit. You said at the beginning, you emphasised over and over that you're a historian and that your story and the story in the book is predominantly a historical story. In the talk that you've just given, it's also clear that it's an economic story, that you've told us about the history leading up to Brexit, and also about what is, in your view, a powerful reason for its being a good thing. Namely, we didn't join the Eurozone. Thank you very much, Gordon Brown. And if we had, that would have tied us in, and it seems to me that that's true. But reading your book, I wanted to press you about two things really here. One is not so much the economic analysis, but also the moral and political analysis, and not so much the history, not so much the past, but the future. So can I just ask you this? The title of the book is This Sovereign Isle. And the argument about leaving the European Union was predominantly, interestingly, both in 2016 and in 1975, because I remember 1975 very well, and I voted in 1975. And the argument in 75 and indeed in 2016 was an argument about sovereignty. It was about taking back control, about being a sovereign state and not a vassal state, and so on. And that was both left and right in 75, but politically. The extraordinary sight of Ian Paisley and Tony Benn on the same side. But so my question is, what do you think sovereignty consists in? What were we taking back control, and what were we taking control of?
Well, I think sovereignty, what I say in the book is that sovereignty is the right to make the final decision. And I was reading the other day, someone else, I can't remember who it was now, said, I thought rather well, sovereignty is the power to decide when the normal rules no longer apply. In other words, it's the right to say when things can be done differently. And I think there's a difference between sovereignty and power. You can be a small country and sovereign without being powerful. And I think often the debate about this mixes the two up. It says, well, there's no point in talking about sovereignty because you won't be able to exercise very much power. The two things are different. Sovereignty is about exercising the power you have and deciding who has the final say in doing what you wish to do. An obvious example of that is, of course, whether or not to join the euro. That was an act of a sovereign decision, and a very important one. Of course, there were other sovereign decisions, which were about who makes the law, who decides what the law is. And in the case of EU membership, the law is increasingly made by the EU Council of Ministers, or indeed the European Parliament occasionally, and it's decided essentially by the European Court of Justice, or the Court of Justice of the European Union, not by British courts. So all these are examples of sovereignty being exercised. And people who say, well, yeah, but in the modern world, no one's really sovereign, or at least a country like Britain isn't sovereign. Well, I think first of all of countries much smaller than us, like Singapore, that exercises sovereignty, or Canada. Canada exercises sovereignty. There's no reason why Britain should not exercise sovereignty. And if you want to, I suppose I would say, if you want to see the difference that this makes, compare Singapore with Hong Kong. Both city-states, both small, both inevitably dependent in many ways on their neighbours. But Singapore has sovereignty and Hong Kong doesn't. And that makes a huge difference. In the case of Britain, I don't know whether you would agree, but I think had we been in the Eurozone, probably the 2008 financial crisis would have been much more damaging for us. And therefore that act of sovereignty shows how these things can be very important. So yes, sovereignty, what I say in the book, which some people think is somewhat radical, I say that sovereignty lies with the people, that in a democracy, the people are essentially sovereign. Okay, there are lots of ways in which that sovereignty is exercised through parliament and so on, but the final decision is essentially a popular one. And that therefore those who wished to prevent or to alter the decision were acting against popular sovereignty. And I think that the EU is tending to shift sovereignty from the people of the member states to the central institutions.
Can I come back on that? And perhaps I should declare my hand. I'm a pretty committed Europhile.
Yes, I thought you were.
So let me put my cards on the table, since you put yours in the book. And in a country like in the United Kingdom, sort of multinational country, there's a real question about how you divide up and reflect, understand the will of the people. So it seems to me that there are two issues here. One is your claim that sovereignty is a matter of the decision of the people, and that seems to me that can be questioned, and in history political thought has been. But here, in the United Kingdom, where we have the four member states, people in Scotland will say, and are saying more and more loudly, well, we aren't the people you're thinking about here. We, the people of Scotland, voted to remain, and we, the people of Northern Ireland, voted to remain. So where is our voice in all of this?
Well, I suppose in a way that you say there are four states. I don't think there are four states. There's one state and four.
Sorry, the member nations was my thought.
Yes, right. Well, okay. I mean, the obvious answer is that this was a vote of the UK population. The minority was divided up in different ways. London also voted to remain. You could say, well, that's just how majoritarian votes go. There are people who win and there are people who lose, and the way we decide to do it, and most people do it, is by counting heads. I mean, there are other ways of doing it, but that's the way we do it. And therefore, as long as you're a member of the United Kingdom, you have to accept the majority view. Okay, I mean, I agree with what I think you're getting at, which is that the United Kingdom is a multinational state. And we are not it seems to me we're not entirely clear as to what this means. And indeed haven't been for a very long time, which is why it's been so difficult to come up with a constitutional framework that suits this. To cut a long story short, though, if you want to talk about this further, I'll do my best, though I'm a historian, not a political philosopher. If the people of Scotland voted to leave the United Kingdom, then we have accepted that they have the right to do so.
I guess. But I suppose the more general question I have is a question about where we draw the lines. I mean, it's easy to say, well, this is what the people decide.
Yes.
But it's always a very contentious and political question, and often a moral question too, as in Northern Ireland. Who are the people who decide this? How do we decide that these people are the ones who count? And in the book, you say, well, you defend your position by saying, well, what matters in the UK should be decided in the UK. But even if we accept the entity that is the United Kingdom, it just isn't the case that the people of Scotland, the people of Northern Ireland, feel that they have decided. They haven't decided. They feel their will has been overridden. I take the point that that's the way democracy works, but it does seem to me to be more problematic than you're conceding.
I guess it's problematic because we, for historical reasons, consider ourselves to be a state made up of several nations. You might not do that. I often, as you said at the beginning, I worked on France. If we'd had the equivalent of the French Revolution, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales would no longer exist as nations any more than Brittany or the Basque Country or Alsace exist as nations. They would be regarded as provinces of a single nation state. We, for historical reasons, accepted and continue to accept that we are made up of different nations, and we give those nations privileges. So Scotland can claim, and I guess most people would accept, that the Scots have an identity which, let's say, the people of East Anglia don't, and that they have a political voice and a political legitimacy which the people of London don't. And all I can say is, yes, this was a vote of the United Kingdom. There could have been other ways of doing it. You could, after all, have said this will be a vote that a sort of federal style vote in which a majority of the constituent nations have to accept that we leave the EU as well, in which case we'd have had 2 yeses and 2 nos. So I don't know where that would have left us. But as we all know, the great problem of the United Kingdom is the disproportionate size of England. So would it be right to allow a minority to decide the fate of the majority on the grounds that they claim a different national identity? Well, yes, if we were a federal state, just as the people of Maine, in some senses, have an equal right as the people of California. But that's not what we are, at least not at the moment. And you can't, as it were, change the rules halfway through and say, well, this was a national vote, but we think it shouldn't have been. I think there are many criticisms one could make of the 2016 referendum, and there are many things that one could criticize about the Scottish referendum in 2014. And I think if we were to have another referendum on Scottish independence, it should not be run in the same way as the earlier one was. But that's something that will no doubt be debated over the next few years if Nicola Sturgeon manages to win a majority of the Scottish Parliament.
Yeah, well, I think it is, and I suppose that's where I was heading in a way. It was from the history to the future, because in the book you say, well, you don't see any in the final chapter. You say, well, there's no reason to think that this decision to leave the European Union will threaten the union of the United Kingdom, so to speak, that it will not threaten. Yeah. It doesn't foreshadow a united Ireland, in your view. It doesn't foreshadow the departure of Scotland. Well, I suppose just as a matter of practical politics, I think you're probably right. But I do think that the decision has accelerated an existing drive in Scotland and possibly in Northern Ireland to take itself away from the United Kingdom. So I guess my question is,
Yeah.
now that we are out, and now that we're heading towards further elections, do you still think that the union is not threatened by the decision to leave?
Well, I think the answer to that is, in a word, no. But I know I'm in a small minority in this, in taking this view. But it's really because of the recent history of Europe and the EU. Okay, it seems to me that membership of the EU is what accelerates separatism within multinational states. Um, we saw this very clearly in the case of Catalonia. Okay, the Catalans were let down by the EU, at least as they saw it. They were expecting the EU to support their claims for independence. And because a small country like Catalonia, which is actually a rather rich little country, or if it's a country, would, if it had become independent from Spain, have become a member state of the EU like Luxembourg or Slovenia, and therefore quite an attractive prospect. In the same way, Scotland, as Nicola Sturgeon, of course, perpetually points out, would like to have a future as a small EU state. I mean, whether that's really as desirable as she says is a matter of debate. But at least it's a coherent aim. Once we're outside the EU, then I can see why it makes Scottish nationalists extremely angry. But it makes the whole prospect of Scottish independence or Scottish leaving the UK much more dangerous. And hence, I would say that it's being in the EU or at least it's what was being in the EU that threatened the UK far more than being out of the EU, unless the Brexit proves a great disaster. In which case, I think certainly it would encourage Scottish and Northern Irish separatism. But as I don't think the Brexit is going to be a great disaster, at least there's no signs of it so far, it seems to me that the desire for in EU membership as a solution is going to get less and less attractive.
We're coming to the end of our time, but I'd like to ask you a question about the views you express in the book about young people. And this is coming from the University of York, and in any proper and normal world, there would be thousands of young people filling lecture theatres and milling round. And as you point out, those young people were overwhelmingly, at the time of the referendum, those who had a vote, were overwhelmingly in favour of remaining. And just anecdotally, it seems to me that many of them are quite resentful now at what they see as the willingness of older people to saddle them with a future outside Europe, which is not a future that they want. And I just wonder, I mean, I feel quite personally quite uncomfortable about that, but then wouldn't I? So I suppose my question is, what do you say to those young people who do say to us, well, you have sold our future?
Yes. Well, I don't think the EU is looking very attractive as a future at the moment. And I think that more and more people will come to realise that. I asked one of my own students about the time of the referendum why it was that so many students supported EU membership. And he was a very politically active and also very intelligent student. And he said, well, it's because for most of us, it's the only thing we've ever known. And it seems a very dangerous thing to change. So I think in some ways it was a vote for the status quo. Okay, I would say there's also a class element in it, obviously. University students are by definition part of the middle class, and they are, whatever their origins. And it is precisely the group that sees its future as part of a globalized world, which the EU seem to represent. I mean, it's quite surprising how few British students, the Erasmus scheme was something that often came up in discussion, how few British students actually go to continental Europe under the Erasmus scheme. Far more of them go to English-speaking countries outside the EU, and far more of them get jobs in English-speaking countries outside the EU. So it seemed to me that the attachment to the EU was much more theoretical than practical. And also, I think, and this is something that I don't really talk about much in the book, though I've come to think of it as being more important, this was really a thing about British domestic politics, far more than it was about European politics. And that therefore voting to remain was to say, we don't want the country to be run by people like Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson. And I think that is probably the thing that counted most for younger people, who, of course, as always, tend to take a sort of left-wing and progressive view.
I guess my question was a slightly different one, though, if I can press a little bit harder. It's a question about, it's a question of this kind, or a thought of this kind.
Yes.
What you, the older people, have done is to order the meal and walk away when the bill comes in. And we, the younger people, are now left to pick up that bill down the line. So we haven't been given a proper voice. And this is independent of whether or not they want to go to Europe, whether they want to join the Erasmus scheme. It is the thought that we have decided and they will pay.
Well, I suppose in a sense that's true. And if you thought there was going to be a great bill, then you would have to say, who's going to pay it? I mean, I don't think there is going to be a great bill. And if I thought there was, then I'd probably take a different view. But then, of course, this would make any election very difficult to decide. In that young people very often vote differently from older people. You'd have to maybe the over 50s should not be allowed to vote anymore. I mean, a flippant answer might be the effects of Brexit will affect you and me for the whole of our lives. They will affect 21-year-olds for a fairly short part of their lives. Therefore, the decision is as weighty for us as it is for them, if not more so.
And I don't accept the argument, but it's an interesting argument. I think we're coming to the end of our time anyway. So I would just like to thank you most warmly for accepting the invitation, for coming and giving us a tremendous talk and a really fascinating discussion. I have been most intrigued to hear your views, and also for producing this very, very provocative book and beautifully written book, this Sovereign Isle. So thank you very much indeed, Robert. I should just say that the recording of the event will be available on the festival YouTube channel, which is to be found on the festival website. And anyone who would like to purchase a copy of Robert's book, and I hope you will, should note that the book will be available from the university's partner bookseller, Fox Lane Books. And again, you can get information about that on the festival website. So it just remains for me to thank you again, really very warmly, for a most interesting book and a really interesting discussion. Thank you.
But I thank you too, Sue. It's a great pleasure to have such a civil conversation about a matter that is clearly divisive, and perhaps it's a sign that the time of anger and recrimination is passing.
Let's hope so. Thank you.